I want to call to order the meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee, and welcome to the October meeting of the Board of Governors. Mikey, would you please take the roll? Here. Thank you, Mikey. Wow, this mic is really loud. Wow. Okay. I'll whisper. There you go. I got a face for it. Want to call the meeting to order. We've got a lot to talk about in the next hour. Hopefully we'll try to get this done within the next hour. First thing on the agenda, however, are the committee minutes in your packet from our June 9th conference call and our June 18 meeting in Orlando. You've had a chance to review them. Any changes or corrections to the minutes? Nope. Seeing none, is there a motion to approve? All in favor, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. We'll move into agenda item 3, which are our fees and flexible tuition policies. Now, if you recall, as part of the governance agreement between the board and the legislature, House Bill 7237 gave us the authority to approve new fee increases to certain existing fees and flexible tuition policies, including block tuition and market rate tuition. I'll tell you now that the market rate tuition issue is being deferred until our next meeting. We've met, we've talked about them on our conference calls. However, I'm still not comfortable with where we are, and I've asked the Council of Academic Vice Presidents to take a look at that issue. They'll be talking about market rate tuition tonight at their meeting, and we'll take it up at our November meeting. So at this meeting, what we're going to talk about are the new fees, the fee increases, and the block tuition regulations. At the June meeting, as you know, we established a tuition and fee working group, which included Governor Duncan, Governor Tripp, Governor Franklin, and myself, as well as Provost Abel, Glover, and Workman. And I appreciate everyone participating in those calls. Some of them went 2 and 3 hours long, but we did meet a couple of times over the summer, and we've developed the regulation language that's in your packets and was sent to you for us to review today. As you know the procedure, we'll review them today, we'll post them for 30 days, and then finalize them subject to whatever comments come in at our next meeting. The challenge with market rate has been a little bit difficult to get arms around, and I know it was kind of my decision to push that off until next month, but I think the working group will agree that we were having some challenges figuring out exactly where all the inputs were coming from. So anyway, I've pushed that to the Council of Academic Vice Presidents, and hopefully we'll get some more input from them. What I want to do now is ask Tim to just take the microphone and review the changes that the working group has approved and are recommending to our regulations, particularly specifically in regard to new fees, increase of existing fees, and block tuition, so that we can consider those. So Tim, if you'll start with 7.001, which includes start with the block tuition, if you will, 7.001. That's shown as item 3B on the agenda. I believe it is what page in the book, Tim? Oh, you're right, I'm sorry, that's the new one. No, actually, I apologize. That one is in the packet. The block tuition resolution was emailed out and is in the packet. So if we'll start with 7.001, block tuition, and move from there. Everybody have it out of your packets? Wonderful. Tim, if you would.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you'll take 7.001 and turn to page 27C. Should be in the bottom right-hand corner. There in paren 13 is the beginning of the language dealing with block tuition. Basically what the work group is proposing is that in the normal process, this committee would hear proposals from universities in November with decisions made by the full board at their next meeting, which would be in January. And the policy would still be based on using a per credit hour tuition amount as reflected by the legislature, and the block tuition policy would begin in the fall term. There on the next page, 27D, paren A, are the list of items that the work group would request of boards of trustees to submit to the committee for consideration. And there's a mixture of House bill requirements and work group suggestions. I do want to point out one area of interest, and that's item number A6, dealing with the prepaid contracts. And the legislation was pretty clear that we weren't supposed to do anything that would harm beneficiaries of prepaid contracts. So what this says is that if you had a prepaid contract before the block tuition policy goes into effect, you would still be billed on a per credit hour. But then the Florida Prepaid Board, who has expressed willingness to work with our universities going forward with new contracts and setting them up to take into account block tuition, that the university would need to work with them, figure out how they would implement that from the prepaid standpoint, and then they would report back as part of the presentation to this committee in the future. Also, there's a requirement that the boards of trustees, if block tuition is approved, would do a review every 5 years to see if the policy is meeting its intended outcomes. And those are really the only changes to this regulation, Mr. Chair.
Let me just make sure, because I know I was a little unclear as to how block tuition worked on the call, and frankly, Provost Glover was very instrumental in explaining it to me. Do all the committee members understand how the block tuition just generally works? Okay. Tim, will you give us 2 minutes on block tuition, or Joe, as the case may be?
What a university would do is to determine a range of credit hours that a student could take, and they would be charged for a certain number of those. For instance, the range may be, if you take between 12 and 18 credit hours, you'll be charged for 15. So that's kind of basically the block tuition.
So we pay one rate for a block of hours above or below. And part of the regulation calls for some kind of analysis to tell us where the students are now and how this would equate financially for the students and their impact. So what you have before you then is proposed regulation 7.001 from the working group. And again, we would then hear from universities who made block tuition requests. We'll talk about timing a little bit later, and they will need to explain to us those elements that we've got contained in that regulation as to how they determined what they determined and how they think that's going to impact students and the university. Are there any questions from the committee or comments with regard to proposed regulation 7.001? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve proposed regulation 7.001 for posting, which will then take up in final approval in next month's meeting? There's a motion. Is there a second? And a second. Is there any additional discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting 7.001 as presented with for notice and publication, please say aye. And opposed. Motion carries. Terrific. Tim, will you move on then to 7.003, the provisions dealing with new fees, fees and fines, and penalties.
Yes, sir. This is page 18, and it is in your packet of information. Starting on page 18, there in paragraph 2, this is the list of fees that are currently in statute along with the statutory caps. The fees listed in 2A all the way through 2K are the ones we're talking about that the universities can come to this committee and the board for increases to those caps. What you have underlined at the beginning of 2 are not new new fees are actually coming from a later part of the regulation and just being moved up to the front, so we have them all in one place. If you turn to page 19 is the actual language that the work group has recommended for the committee to consider. In this case, the work group is recommending that boards of trustees kind of notify the committee in the fall if they have any intentions to increase the fee. Then they would submit a proposal in January, and then the committee would take those up in a February meeting with proposals going to the full board at their next meeting, which would be in March. There in paren 3A are the list of items that boards of trustees would need to submit so the committee could have the information in front of them, including items such as, what type of student involvement has been obtained when increasing the fees. There's also some other issues related to specific requirements that were in the House bill. It also indicates that the fees increases would not go into effect until the fall term. And once again, the work group is recommending that the board of trustees do a review every 5 years to see if the increase is meeting its intended outcomes.
Great.
Okay, then if you move to page, so that's all for the increases in existing fees. And I want to walk through some of the other items in the regulation, and we'll get to the new fee section in just a moment. But on page 20, paren 4 is the authority to establish activity, service, health, and athletic fees. I do want to point out a change we need to make in 4B. This year, the legislature changed the cap on what a university could increase their local fees to. Previously, it had been a hard cap at no more than 5%. This year, they've changed that to 5% or the same percentage increase as tuition. So if tuition is the base tuition, not tuition differential, but if the base tuition increase set by the legislature is like 8%, then you could increase your local fees by 8%. There's 3 words I forgot to include in here, and that's or the same percentage increase in tuition, whichever is greater. So we would need to make that amendment.
And we're adding that to 4B at the very end of the underlined phrase.
Yes, sir. Then in 4D, just so the committee is clear, you see some underlines related to health, athletic activity, and service fee. This is replacing 3 paragraphs that follow. We just took 3 separate paragraphs, combined those into one. It doesn't change the intent of the regulation. On page 22 are some technical changes related to paren 6, off-campus educational activities, just a rewording of some language. On page 24, you'll see some strike-throughs. There at paren 24, these are those statutory fees that we moved to the beginning of the regulation. On page 25, paren 21 is the excess hour fee. We've added some additional clarifying language in paren A and C. On page 26, paren 22, you'll see a convenience fee. This is not a new fee. The universities have had this fee for a number of years. We had just failed to include it in our regulation, so we're going back and adding that. And then paren 24 is the work group's language on new fees.
23, right?
Yes, I'm sorry, 23. The process is set up similar to the increases in existing fees. The Board of Trustees would notify the committee in the fall of their intentions. They would submit any proposals in January. The committee would hear them in February with final approval by the board in March. There are a list of items, once again, that the boards of trustees would submit to the committee for consideration. This includes some items that were in the House bill and some additional items the work group recommended. There is also an appeal process similar to the tuition differential appeal language. Also, these fees cannot exceed 10% of tuition. That was a statutory requirement. And the new fees would start in the fall term like all the other increases. I also want to point out that these new fees cannot be used to pay or secure debt. That was a House bill language. And once again, we're asking, the work group asked the boards of trustees to review the fee every 5 years to see if it's met its intended outcome. So those are the changes included in Regulation 7.003.
Great. Thanks, Tim. And again, I want to be clear, we're making two sets of changes to 7.00, well, three sets, actually, some technical changes. One of the sections that we talked about and have addressed focuses on increases of existing fees. The other one focuses on the new fees that are authorized by the legislature, up to 10%, and how those are going to be created and the process that we'll go through in approving those. Once we have this conversation and modify or approve this regulation for posting, we're going to do a little bit of talking about timing and how and when we're going to handle these issues. So for now, are there any questions before we take up a motion? Are there any questions of Tim with regard to 7.003? Okay, seeing none then, is there a motion to approve 7.003 for notice and publication? Got a motion, is there a second? Second. Great, is there any discussion? Seeing none then, all in favor of the motion to approve 7.003 as presented with the change that Tim made from the podium for notice and publication, please say aye. And opposed. The motion carries. Now, that in particular and the block tuition in particular are going to create a bit of a challenge for the budget committee, particularly in year one. We're talking about considering block tuition in November of each year, but since we're not going to have that regulation passed until November, we're talking about this budget committee considering the block tuition requests either in January or February, and we've got the new fee requests that are going to come to us in February as well. So that said, my proposal is let's do that. Let's consider block tuition in January or February, but our February meeting is typically a teleconference of the Board of Governors. I'm going to ask for a separate face-to-face committee meeting of the budget committee, probably in Orlando because it's central. As we looked, we have 2 from the south, 2 from Tallahassee, 2 from Tampa, so it makes sense to do something in Orlando in February, or we can sit down and take our time and look at both the block tuition requests and the new fee requests at that time. So if the committee is amenable and Madam Chair is amenable, I'd like to try to set that meeting in February with staff in the next few weeks and months so that we can properly give these things their due. Any objection?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Chair.
So, like, you set with that schedule, then, you say we'll consider it in January, you have a face-to-face committee meeting prior to our meeting in February. When do you anticipate we'll actually vote on it as a body?
We will probably vote on it as a body in February. I will want a separate budget committee prior to that, face-to-face. Our February board meeting is typically a conference call, not a face-to-face, but I think we'll need to be face-to-face and hear from the universities. So I would have us meet possibly even a week before the board meeting so that then at the board meeting we can have final approval. And then next year, block tuition would be considered in the November meeting, but just this year we're off cycle. The fees will always be considered at that February meeting on a moving forward. Okay. Everyone's comfortable with that schedule? Universities, you're okay with that schedule? It's about the best we can do, I'm afraid. Great. Well, that said, let's move on with the agenda and take a look at the 2010-2011 State University System operating budgets. Tim, you might as well get back up there. As you know, boards of trustees are responsible for the day-to-day operations, but our job is to give oversight to the operating budgets that were submitted by the universities. They are in the packet that was mailed, and Tim's got a slide, and the slides are there and behind us. So, Tim, do you want to make your presentation, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Each board of trustees does adopt an annual operating budget. They do submit those to us for review in August. And pursuant to the board's master powers and duties, we review those and bring them to you for approval. We have reviewed the budgets. They conform with our regulations, and they are all maintaining a 5% reserve as required in our regulations, which is very important given the economic climate we're having this year and next year. Just for some of our members, because I know we have several new ones, and this is your first time through this, that our boards of trustees are responsible for the day-to-day operations of their budget and expenditures. So what I'm going to show you here, just a high-level overview of the system operating budget. And this is, detail is in your packet. The operating budget summary begins on page, let me find those.
28, I
Page
think.
30. You can see a system summary on page 33 and 34. Then behind that is each individual university summary. Going across the top of the spreadsheet is the various budget entities that universities operate under. Then going down the left-hand side are the various categories that tie back to state appropriation categories. This chart shows that the total system operating budget is over $9 billion. The dark green section, which is the education and general portion of the budget, is what we'll be talking about later on this afternoon as we do the legislative budget request. And you can see that the E&G funds consist of tuition and state funds, general revenue lottery, and in this case, this year, stimulus funds. So it makes up about 38% of the total university's operating budget, which is down from when about 5 years ago when it made up about 42% of the budget. As you can see, contracts and grants are another large component at about 22%. This primarily consists of federal grants, some state grants and local grants. You have auxiliaries, which is your housing, your bookstores, parking facilities. Then your local funds comprise about 25%. These are for financial aid and other specific fees that a university would charge, such as their student activities or technology fee. And then finally, there is the faculty practice plan revenues, which is for our medical schools. You hear a lot about universities having large budgets, and we do. We're a large enterprise. So when folks talk about, well, cutting the university system, you have many dollars that you can replace those state funds with. Well, that's not true, because the majority of the funds that the universities get are restricted to specific activities, such as your contracts and grants. You cannot take those dollars and just move them over to E&G and fund E&G activities. Same way with your local funds, which are restricted for specific activities there. Your auxiliaries, you have a little more flexibility, but generally the revenue associated with that auxiliary unit stays in the auxiliary unit to continue funding its operations, repairs, maintenance, upkeep, or debt service if it has any of those expenditures. So, Mr. Chair, that's the overview of the operating budget for the current year.
Great, thanks, Tim. Are there any questions for Tim on just kind of the operating budget overviews? We're going to get into the LBRs next, but on the overall operating budget? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to approve the 2010-2011 university operating budgets as presented? On a motion, is there a second? Second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. And opposed. That motion carries. Thank you. The next item to look at is our 2011-2012 legislative budget requests for the university system itself and the board offices. And although the economy is somewhat stabilized a little bit from the last couple of years of hell, we also know the growth is basically minimal. If I did say that, I'm sorry. Growth is minimal. And the budget office has made some projections that are somewhat positive. The revenue estimating office has made some projections which are somewhat positive. However, those projections came out before we take any effect of the Gulf spill or what may or may not impact the state and the state's revenues as a result of the Gulf oil spill. The legislature has asked each of the agencies, including our universities, to prepare two budgets, one reflecting a 5% cut, another one reflecting a 15% cut. We've been through this exercise before. We understand what this means. It may be a tough budget year, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So in your packet, starting on, those are in your packet, and additionally in your packet, starting on page 110, we've got some information relating to the federal stimulus funds for the state of Florida as well. This is the last year we're going to get those funds, and we've asked each of the universities in the past, and in your packet are their presentations explaining how they are going to cover the shortfall from not receiving those stimulus funds in the future. And frankly, their options are varied and very diverse. Some are using additional tuition revenues to fill the hole, some are cutting courses, some are finding larger class size, some are adding teaching assignments, but each of the university's plans are presented there for your review, and you'll want to take a look at them. They're actually pretty interesting and somewhat creative. If additional budget cuts happen, obviously more flexibility will be required, and we can visit it at that time. We also know that as budgets continue to tighten and increases become less and less to the extent we get any, we're going to need to continue to look for efficiencies. Governor Duncan has been a leader in finding efficiencies, finding some synergy amongst the university system, and I know she's going to make a report later on today in her own committee meeting about some shared services and other issues, but I didn't know, we've got a little bit of time. Governor Duncan, if you want to say anything about what you're doing here at this meeting, or just sort of save it all to make sure people come to your meeting later?
Well, I guess I'll suffice it to say that I'm anxiously looking forward to passing the baton on some of the administrative efficiencies to Governor Rood. Not that I won't stay engaged and be involved in that, but I think it is an important issue. It's one that everyone's worked hard on. I found it very interesting reading each institution's discussion on their efficiencies and what that meant to each one, how you answered that question. And I think just getting everybody kind of answering the same question as to, some talked about academic efficiency, some talked about energy, some talked about administration, and I think the answer is it's all of the above, and just how we continue to plow through that. And I'll save some of the academic discussions for my committee. I think you've got enough on your agenda today.
Great, thank you, Governor Duncan. And finally, the budget request that we're looking for is clearly an advocacy budget, and the cornerstone of this LBR is the New Florida Initiative and the importance of the New Florida Initiative and the role that the university system is going to play in the future of the state. And I think I'll be remiss if I don't ask the Chancellor if he wants to weigh in for a moment on New Florida. I waited for him to get a mouthful of something. There you go.
It's no different when you go to dinner. The waiter always waits until you take a bite of food to say, "So how is everything?" Good. You okay, Mikey? There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir. We have put together what we think is a good, strong advocacy budget on behalf of the state university system under the aegis of New Florida. We know that, and you were right, the recent projections are far better than the original projections. $6 billion deficit is one thing, $2.5 billion is something there again, and while it's still sizable, it is very different than we were originally looking toward. So to that end, we have put together an approximate 6% overall increase. We've been working closely with the institutions in terms of their LBRs to try to make certain that whatever we're advocating for falls in line with the vision of the system and that with the vision of each of our institutions. This is, I think, in many ways timely, Mr. Chair, since we went through the work plan exercise just several months ago and had a great overview by our universities as to what direction they were moving and what they were going to need to accomplish to get there. So this is a budget that we aren't just advocating for, we feel strongly about it and believe that if we can see this funded, our system will be able to take a significant move forward, especially if you consider where we've been over the last several years. This would allow us to begin to move in a positive direction. So we will work with all of the members of the board and our boards through our presidents to make sure everyone is apprised as to exactly what that budget looks like, what it will mean to their own institution, but also what it would mean system-wide, so then we can all advocate for it as we work with the leadership of the House and the Senate.
Great. Thanks, Chancellor. Tim, will you walk us through?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Before I get to the LBR, I want to provide the committee with an overview of the state budget and some of the challenges that they are facing, touching on the $2.5 billion deficit that they're projecting. This is the entire state budget for the current year, a little more than $70 billion. It includes operating as well as fixed capital outlay, includes general revenue, lottery, and all of the various trust funds. And you can see Health and Human Services makes up the largest proportion of the budget. And that's actually up from where we were about 5 years ago when they made up about 38% of our budget. Education is about 32%, up just about 1% over the last 5 years. The budget also includes about $3.7 billion in federal stimulus money that will be going away after the current year. If you just want to look at the operating portion of the state budget, this takes out all the trust funds. This is where the university system and education in general is funded from. There's about a $25 billion state operating budget. Education gets almost a little more than 55% of that proportion. Just taking the education pie, most of that goes to public schools, with the university system getting about 16%. And that's about the same percentage that we had received 5 years ago. These are the lottery and general revenue projections from the State Estimating Conference, and you can see there is gradual growth over the next few years. All of that is really in the general revenue budget. Lottery is expected to be flat, hence all the changes you've seen in the Bright Futures program over the last couple of years, because that lottery pot isn't growing to keep up with Bright Future demands. Of course, these estimates do not include any the oil spill impact. We heard yesterday that the estimating conferences may deal with that at their next conference, which would be sometime in November. The legislature always does a 3-year financial outlook, which they released a couple of weeks ago, and they met yesterday in the Legislative Budget Commission to review that outlook and subsequently adopt it. And I wanted to walk the committee through the projection for 2011-12. And you can see the estimating conference is just here for just focusing on general revenue and estimating about $25.2 billion. If you look at the state's recurring base budget, this is taking out the non-recurring funds that go away after this year. There's a base of almost $22.6 billion. And if you stopped right there, there's plenty of general revenue to cover the state's base. But there are some certain items that the legislature has to deal with. One is a transfer of funds to the budget stabilization to keep for a rainy day. And then there's some areas they've identified as critical needs or high priority needs. And in your pack in front of you, there's a blue sheet of paper that has key budget drivers on it. And this is what the commission has looked at, is determining what are those critical needs that the state has to fund in 11-12 that will result in additional revenue needing to be generated. The first half of this sheet has those critical needs, and you can see the very first item, and I apologize for the small print, this isn't mine, this is theirs. The first item is the replacement of federal stimulus funds of $1.2 billion for education, and the university system has about $145 million in its budget. So one of their critical needs that they've identified is coming up with the revenue from somewhere to plug the hole in federal stimulus. The next largest item is the Medicaid program of $1.5 billion. And then there's a host of other little items in there, but the total critical needs as they've identified is $3.2 billion. And below that you have other high priority needs of about $1.7 billion. And if you look through some of those, there is the replacement of some federal stimulus funds that they call non-core programs. But there's also some estimates for specific items related to the university system, such as workload and enrollment. So they're projecting that the universities will need some funding for enrollment growth and access. Other issues such as plant operations and maintenance funding, which they normally fund every year. They have also included estimates for FIU and UCF medical schools. And they've even put in about $60 million for the colleges and university system payments toward major gift matching programs. So those are the kinds of items they've identified as high priority. So you take those into account, the total estimated expenditures, you have about 27.7 billion, thus a $2.5 billion deficit that the Chancellor mentioned earlier. So that's how the legislature is deriving at their numbers going forward. The 2012, 13, and 13, 14 estimates as part of their 3-year financial outlook follow the same process. They've estimated about $2.8 billion deficit in 12, 13, and $1.9 billion deficit in 13, 14. As Governor Perez said, when the legislature came out with their LBR instructions back in July, they asked each agency, including education entities, to prepare for a 5% cut in the current year and a 15% cut in 11-12. So a 5% cut for the university system is about $100 million. For the board office, almost $200,000. Then you can see the equivalent amount of a 15% cut. And just kind of put it in proportion, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've lost over $600 million in our base budget operations. Now, we have received some general revenue funding back for specific targeted areas, such as increases in retirement, increases in health insurance, or specific university initiatives such as medical school implementation, to help offset some of those cuts. But there has really been no money other than tuition increases that we've received to go into the base operations. And this is where we currently stand in terms of state funds for the SUS is $2.15 billion. You just think what the system would look like if we still had that $600 million in our budget and be close to $2.7 billion. Here's the E&G appropriated funds over the last few years. The dark bar are the state funds, and you can see the decline we've had since 06, 07. And of course, these are net of any increases that I just talked about. And you can see the proportion of state funding to our total has declined to about 60%, and tuition, obviously with the increases in the cuts in state funds, makes up the other proportion, with federal stimulus having just a little bit of the funds. This next chart, when I was doing it, it was around lunchtime, so I was kind of hungry and pizza sounded kind of good, but I wanted the committee to kind of see how it works in terms of the PICO allocations versus the general revenue funding that we're going to be talking about in a minute for operations. The estimating conference provides everyone with the estimates for PICO and general revenue. But for PICO, there's a statutory formula that says you run the dollars through the formula. This is how much is going to go to K-12, how much will go to colleges, and how much will go to universities. So there's no quibbling among the sectors on who's going to get what. So we know exactly what our slice of the pie will be, and that's what we build our budget on. And you'll hear Chris talking about that later in facilities. But for general revenue, it's a little bit different. The estimating conference comes up with the estimate, but there's no statutory formula for allocation. Everybody is in there lobbying and asking for as much as they can get for their entities. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to move on to the LBR. All of this information is in your packet, and I'll touch on some of the highlights. And this is the overview of the budget request. You have the E&G core budget. This is your main instructional component of the universities. We're asking for $3.1 billion, or 0.2% increase over the current year. And you can see that for what we call the special units, Institute of Food and Agricultural Science, and the various health science centers. And we also have Institute of Human Machine Cognition, Moffitt Cancer Center, and Major Gifts. So the total budget request is $3.8 billion, about 6% more than it is over the current year. What are some of our key issues? And you've heard the Chancellor talk about New Florida. And in your packet, starting on page 96, is each university's submissions related to New Florida. What we did is we took each university's recurring base budget and allocated the $150 million proportional. So everybody got about a 7% increase. And we asked them using the work plan that you submitted and presented to the board back in June, how would you spend these dollars for New Florida if you did receive those? So what you have on page 96 are summaries of those submissions. We have all the detail. It's in a binder about the size of your board agenda, so we didn't include everything in the packet. But we also included on page 107, we sorted it by university. So if you're interested in looking at a particular institution and what they submitted, you will see that information. But here you can kind of see the various categories that universities kind of lump their proposals in. STEM disciplines of about 40 million. I'm just going to run through some examples so you can kind of get an idea of what is included here. FSU is looking for funds to recruit or retain faculty in the STEM areas. Florida Atlantic was wanting some dollars through partnership with biotech companies such as Scripps and Torrey Pines. We had 3 universities make presentations in June wanting to grow their enrollments: Florida Gulf Coast, University of North Florida, and FSU in their graduate programs. We have some various student access issues. FAMU is wanting to do some online degree programs. University of West Florida is wanting to enhance their student advising to help students get through the system quicker and retain their students. And the largest area is obviously in research and technology, which we know is a very important component of New Florida. And yet it's not just about every university putting forth some initiatives for research. And then finally, for medical education, this would include the continued phase-in of the 2 new medical schools and operations for existing medical schools. Some of our other key issues include P&M funding for new and existing facilities. The universities have over 36 million gross square feet of just E&G facilities that they have to maintain. They spend over $250 million a year just for P&M. So the recurring funds that we get from the legislature for new facilities and existing facilities is very important. We're also requesting a replacement of some non-recurring general revenue we got this year. The universities have used those one-time dollars to purchase equipment, library materials, and we would like those dollars replaced so they can continue those types of purchases. Everyone's familiar with FIO and all the work they've done in the Gulf this summer. They presented a request for $7.2 million for additional crew and additional equipment that they found is necessary for their continued operations. There's some detail on what they are looking to do with those funds on page 86 of your packet. And finally, the Major Gift Matching Program, and this is not to be confused with the Cortellis program. This is the kind of the operating portion of the Matching Gift Program. We have donors who've stepped up over the last 4 years and have donated over $250 million to the university system. The state match on that $250 million is $194 million. And in your packet on page 94, you can see how that backlog is accumulated by fiscal year. So we're obviously not optimistic that we would get this fully funded, but if the legislature would happen to have some non-recurring funds, and maybe they could match some of those donors' submissions. And the good thing about the donors' funding is it does go to the university. It is placed in their investment portfolio, and they are able to use those earnings for scholarships or professorships or whatever their donors' agreements are. So the money isn't just sitting there not being used. They are making good use of that. They just need those additional state funds to almost double the investment money that they can use. So the 11-12 LBR really just keeps our funding per student at about the same level as it is this year. We're not asking for a huge increase. It goes up just less than a 0.5%. And finally, for the board general office, we're not requesting an increase over the current year. We're looking for a flat budget. Our main priority is to get the $1.5 million of federal stimulus money in our budget replaced with another source of revenue. And Mr. Chair, that concludes the overview of the OBR.
Thanks, Tim. Great report. Any questions for Tim with regard to the OBR or the state budget or the board office budget? Chancellor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just another more specific comment about New Florida. As you saw from Tim's slides, one of the benefits of taking this new approach is our continued ability to be more specific with the legislature by institution and by system as to the kinds of things that the money that they would provide us would go directly to do. Call it strategic planning, I suppose, but it really does give us a much greater ability to demonstrate to those that we need that this is really more an investment than it is an expenditure, that you are investing dollars in more degree production, which the state desperately needs. You're investing dollars in research and development, which will bring a return on investment to the state of Florida. And so while some might believe that $150 million request in this economic environment is rather out of the question, we really believe that this is a continued effort to make sure that the legislature understands that by investing in the state university system, you're investing in the continued economic development portfolio of Florida and creating that knowledge-based economy. And hopefully as we go through the committee process, as we work through the individual members, by demonstrating to them with great clarity what the money is, but more specifically where it would go and what it would bring back by way of return on investment, we can continue to demonstrate those things. Last word, Mr. Chair, on the stimulus issue, and I continue to say this not selfishly, but as a matter of fact, we're all going to deal as a state with the day of reckoning on the federal stimulus money. Everybody knew it was coming the day we signed up for that. And I think many believed that by the time the day of reckoning came, the economy would have turned around so significantly that the stimulus issue would not be an issue any longer. I can tell you, operating an office with about 50 people in it, almost half of whom are funded now through federal stimulus money, and with almost no other place to go to recoup those funds if we don't have it replaced, it would take just the Board of Governors office to about half of what we already are. We'd be into the 20s. So that issue continues to be critical to all of us. And again, I think we've showed a good faith effort that we're willing to organize ourselves in a way to recognize that there's not a great deal of money to backfill it with, but at the same time, it is an issue that we're all going to have to deal with, not just in the state university system, but as a state in the next 18 months.
No doubt.
But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chancellor. Governor Duncan?
This is, sorry, more of a comment maybe than a question for Tim. And I know it's not a this year issue, but I just would like to get it out there for next year. I really do think we need to be looking at the board office budget of some high-level VP, whatever the right title would be, person kind of dedicated to supporting all the health-related initiatives. I mean, we have grown substantially in that endeavor, and it is a big part of our budget, as we saw. And I think that, I know the resources are short this year, but I don't want us all to lose sight of, I think, how important that is, and for all of our medical schools and other health-related issues, that we consider how we deal with that growing demand as a system.
Great. Thanks, Governor Duncan. Any other comments or questions? If none, I'll need two motions so that we can move forward. The first will be a motion to approve the 2011-2012 legislative budget request for the state university system, and to authorize the chancellor to make whatever technical, administrative, or ministerial changes that are required. Is there a motion? Is there a motion? Is there a second? Second. And a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed. The motion carries. And the second motion I'd be looking for is a motion to approve the 2011-2012 LBR request for the board office, also authorizing the chancellor to make any administrative, ministerial changes that are required. There's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. And the motion carries 1-0. Thank you for voting, Governor Tripp. That actually concludes our agenda. A couple things I still want to point out. At our June meeting, we approved 2 amended regulations. We posted them for comment. They were Regulation 7.008 on waiver of tuition and fees, and 9.009, preparation of university financial statements. There were no comments received during the public notice period, so we'll be advancing those as a committee to the board this afternoon for final adoption. I also want to thank the working group for the inordinate amount of time and thoughtfulness that went into these regulations. I know we approved them rather quickly today without much discussion, but there were several very lengthy conference calls that we all participated in. I want to thank the group for that, and particularly the provosts, Abel, Glover, and Workman, for chiming in, particularly Provost Glover, who gave us a white paper on market rate tuition, which we'll be able to deal with next month, but it certainly made the process much, much easier.
Abel, Glover, and Workman, sounds like a law firm, doesn't it?
It does. Actually, it sounds like a good double play combination to me, but it's okay. Abel to Glover to Workman, but notwithstanding, I want to thank you gentlemen for that service. It was great. I know the meetings were long and the phone calls were very long, but they were also very important. And finally, at our November meeting, we'll take up the market rate regulations. We'll take up these regulations for final adoption. But because of the conversations that were going on during this fee setting and during the differential tuition, we felt that it was pretty important to try to kind of get our arms around financial aid, how it works, who's impacted when we have these increases, what are the real costs to students. And I've scheduled a financial aid workshop for the November meeting, which will be held at the University of Florida. On the Thursday morning of our board meeting, we'll be doing a workshop on financial aid immediately following the budget committee meeting, where we can just kind of get some information and take some input with regard to how these decisions are impacting students, what financial aid is available, what is true cost to attend, so that as we have these conversations in the future with all of these different mechanisms of raising tuition and raising fees and everything else we do, we'll at least have a better sense of what resources are available to students and what real costs are. So with that, if there's nothing else, yeah, Chair Parker.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for all the hard work you put into getting us ready for this agenda. And just like you stated that maybe there weren't a lot of questions today, but it certainly was because of all the hard work that you and your committee and your special work group put into putting everything together in preparation for today. So I didn't want you to close your meeting without giving you special commendations and a special thanks for your leadership.
Thanks, Chairman. Anything else? Seeing none, we'll be adjourned.